Hey, class. Just a couple more words about the North Africa campaign and Stalingrad, and just a reminder that they happened somewhat simultaneously. The invasion of North Africa was in November of 1942, the U.S. invasion, just as the counterattacks, the Russian counterattacks against the German army were about to take place. Also, remember that in the summer of 1942, Roosevelt was so concerned that the Soviet Union was going to be defeated by the German army that he had planned, and he was very, very serious about having an invasion of France in the autumn of 1942. If the Soviet Union collapsed, it would have been this kind of very heroic, desperate Allied move into France to create a second front to take some of the pressure off the Soviet army. But this shows how desperate the situation was in the Soviet Union in the summer of 1942. And it also shows how closely US military and political officials were paying attention to what was going on in the Soviet Union. And we've lost this in our collective memory, and the same things happened in the in Russia as well. Countries tend to focus on their own histories, and you know what? That makes a lot of sense. It's understandable. But as scholars of World War II, I just want you to kind of put it together, and I want you to always be thinking that about the significance of what was going on in the Soviet Union during this period, and what a close call it was in the summer of 1942. And U.S. officials, U.S. military, were super aware of that, super aware of it. We've forgotten it today, but they were aware of it at the time. And so a couple more words on North Africa specifically. I've talked a lot about Churchill's soft underbelly plan, been pretty critical of it, his overall strategy, really, to attack Germany around the periphery, especially in the Mediterranean. And I'll show you that great topographical map. And Marshall, of course, was reluctant to invade North Africa. He thought it was a diversion. He didn't think it was significant. Marshall, the head of the U.S. Army, and basically Roosevelt forces him to order the invasion of North Africa. Marshall goes so far as to say he wants to pick up his marbles and just focus on Japan. He's so opposed to the North Africa campaign, and Roosevelt calls his bluff. And remember, I'm talking a lot about Marshall, but the person pulling the strings is Roosevelt. He's making the decisions. He's really the master strategist of the war, certainly for the U.S. So I want to make a point here. Marshall was wrong about North Africa, and Churchill was right. And not only Churchill was right, FDR was right. FDR needed some kind of action in Europe. The US public, as Marshall said kind of bitterly after the war, needed to be entertained. There was an election coming up in November 1942, and Roosevelt actually casually mentioned to Marshall he wished the invasion could happen before the election, but he kept his hands off after that. And ultimately, the invasion didn't happen until after the midterm elections of 1942. But Roosevelt, for political reasons, but also for public morale reasons, and I think he just agreed with Churchill, something had to be done. Stalin needed some kind of relief, and it was just too soon to invade France. We didn't have the training, we didn't have the landing ships, we didn't have the troops in England ready to invade. It just would not have worked. It would have been a disaster, really. So Churchill basically is right to push for North Africa, and FDR was right to support him. Marshall is wrong. North Africa turned out to be a good idea. And one of the people that thought it was a good idea was Joseph Stalin himself. The Allies were very worried what Stalin would think about the North Africa campaign, that it was a diversion. Of course, Stalin is just demanding that the Allies, the British and the Americans, invade France and create a second front to take some of the pressure off him. But he was actually okay when U.S. troops landed in North Africa in November of 1942. He went along with it. He wasn't scornful of the idea. And North Africa turned out to be a positive experience for the United States, or an important experience. First of all, let's not forget that 250,000 German soldiers, Italian soldiers as well, were captured. That's not insignificant. 91,000 were captured at Stalingrad, so it's more than twice as many Germans or Axis powers that were captured at Stalingrad. Although I do think Stalingrad is much more important strategically in terms of a battle. But North Africa was a major victory for the United States and for the British. And the other aspects of the North Africa campaign, our Army, the U.S. Army particularly, learned how to fight, learned the logistics of war in the 1940. Some of the weaker commanders, and I haven't really gone into detail about this, some of the weaker U.S. commanders were cashiered, they were fired. Some of the stronger U.S. commanders, including Patton, were pushed to the front. So Marshall and Roosevelt learned what generals that they could count on, and Dwight Eisenhower as well, who becomes the head of the U.S. Army in Europe. Marshall's the overall head of the U.S. Army, but the head of the U.S. Army in Europe is Eisenhower, but Marshall was Eisenhower's boss. So Marshall and Roosevelt, they learn about who they could trust in terms of officer corps, who they couldn't trust. Our infantry learned how to fight all the way up and down the line. It turned out to be an excellent lesson in war for the U.S. troops and the veterans of North Africa. Those that fought and survived, those would be the folks that would lead the invasion of Italy and then the invasion of Europe just 2 years later. The other strategic part of North Africa that was significant was it opened up the Mediterranean for U.S. shipping, and it allowed Lend-Lease supplies to go through the Suez Canal to Iran, which was the easiest route for a large percentage of the Lend-Lease supply. So it kept the Mediterranean out of Axis hands, out of German hands. So it kept the Suez Canal in the hands of the British. So it was significant. It was a very significant victory. So let's not put it down, which I kind of think I was doing. Long story short, in this case, Churchill was right, and backed up by Roosevelt, Marshall wrong. Now, you might want to wonder where some of those prisoners ended up, and actually, 50,000 German soldiers were held prisoner in Texas during World War II. And a large percentage of those German soldiers and some Italian soldiers came from the North Africa campaign. So, boy, those were the lucky ones, right? They didn't have to fight on the Eastern Front. So just a quick map here of something that I don't think many folks know about. 50,000 POWs in Texas during World War II. Camp Huntsville in East Texas, it held 5,000 prisoners of war. You had Camp Hereford in North Texas. It held 5,000 Italian prisoners. And some of these prisoners actually were used as farm labor. 11,000, over 11,000 prisoners were used as farm labor in Texas during World War II, which was important because there was a shortage of men to work on the farms in World War II because there was the demand for the U.S. Army and U.S. industry. So a number, like I say, over 11,000 German soldiers, and this affects me personally because my daughter-in-law's family owns land outside of College Station, and they've owned land since the 1840s in that area of Texas, and they had German soldiers, POWs, working their land. So one of the little side notes of the North Africa campaign, thousands of the prisoners of the North Africa campaign, the prisoners of war, actually ended up in the Lone Star State.